For centuries, the Lumar people ruled the galaxy's seas and rivers with their feared hydro weapons, liquid compounds so deadly that a single drop could dissolve living tissue in seconds. Entire fleets surrendered rather than face them. But when the first human cadet arrives for elite training, General Apo expects fear, discipline, and respect. Instead, he finds Richard Maxwell, curious, distracted, and strangely fascinated with the weapons for entirely different reasons. As training begins, the Lumar grow uneasy. Weapon stock mysteriously vanishes. Security systems fail to catch the thief. And Richard keeps asking suspiciously detailed questions about fermentation and flavor profiles. The Lumar's deadliest secret is about to collide with humanity's most unexpected cultural trait, and the outcome will turn the meaning of weapon on its head. The city of Lumar shimmered under a haze of warm moisture, its living architecture glistening like suspended droplets frozen in time. Towering structures of translucent membrane curved toward the sky, each one pulsing faintly with the slow heartbeat of the bioengineered tissue that held them together. Beneath their surfaces, hidden channels pumped nutrient gel through veins that ran from foundation to rooftop, keeping the structures alive. General Apo glided across the shallow gel-filled street, his semi-transparent body flowing with practiced grace. Every step left small ripples behind, faint patterns in the liquid floor that spoke of calm authority. To the Lumar, ripples were language, subtle vibrations that revealed a person's emotional state more truthfully than words. Today, Apo's ripples betrayed agitation. The Reason walked a few paces ahead of him, solid boots splashing through the gel paths with unrefined steps. Richard Maxwell, the first human to ever set foot inside the Lumar military district, didn't seem impressed by the alien city surrounding him. His head tilted back as he looked at the glistening walls. "These buildings, how do they keep them from dripping all the way down?" he asked, running a hand through his damp hair. "They do not drip," Apo replied stiffly, his voice vibrating the air in low, deliberate tones. "They are sustained by internal gel veins. It is advanced bioengineering, perfected over centuries." "Cool," Richard muttered, already glancing toward a side canal where a group of juvenile Lumar darted through the gel like silver eels. His boots left chaotic splashes, the kind that grated against Apo's senses like static noise. Apo reminded himself that orders were orders. The human had been selected for the elite Hydro Core exchange program after what the High Command called rigorous evaluation. What criteria had been used for that evaluation, Apo could not guess. They approached a wide, oval building whose surface pulsed faintly, releasing a constant mist into the air. A membrane archway parted for them, folding back like liquid being pushed aside. Inside, the temperature rose immediately, the Lumar's optimal range for hydro weapon storage. Rows of transparent tanks lined the walls, each filled with liquid that shimmered like molten glass under the bioluminescent ceiling. "This is the heart of our military strength," Apo said. His ripples deepened, conveying solemn respect. "Our hydro compounds are capable of dissolving any organic tissue within moments. A single drop is, yeah, magic water." "Got it," Richard interrupted, pressing his face close to one of the tanks. His breath left a faint fog on the transparent surface. Apo's ripples tightened sharply. "Not magic. Science. Weaponized biochemistry. The P-47 strain, for example, ended the Great Lake conflict in less than 2 days." Richard gave a low whistle. "Looks, drinkable." The word slammed into the general's senses like a shockwave. He could only stare, unsure if he'd heard correctly. "Drinkable?" The human shrugged. "I mean, if it didn't kill you. Looks like a, fancy cocktail." Two nearby Lumar officers stiffened, their own ripples shifting into alarm. Apo forced his body to remain steady. "Cadet Maxwell," he said in the slow, heavy tone of someone issuing a final warning, "you must never approach these weapons without supervision. One accidental touch could end your existence." Richard raised his hands innocently. "Relax. I'm not touching. Just, admiring the craftsmanship. His gaze lingered on the tanks a moment too long, as though committing every curve and connection to memory. They moved deeper into the facility, passing a training arena where squads of Lumar soldiers practiced maneuvers. Streams of deadly liquid arced in precise patterns, evaporating harmlessly into mist before reaching the observation platform. Richard leaned on the railing, watching intently. "They're wasting a lot," he said casually. "Wasting? Yeah. If it's that powerful, why spray so much at once? Seems inefficient." Apo's ripples flared with irritation. "Coverage is critical for immobilizing targets. Concentration alone is not enough. It must be, sure. But if you kept it in smaller doses," Richard trailed off, almost to himself, "you could preserve more of the flavor profile." Apo froze. Flavor profile? The human smiled, quick and harmless. Figure of speech. But the general had lived long enough to know when someone was lying. That night, the Lumar quarters prepared for the human were set to Earth standard humidity. Apo made a discreet pass by the door, his senses tuned to any irregular vibration. Inside, he could hear the faint rustle of paper and the clicking of a human data device. Everything seemed in order. What Apo didn't know was that Richard sat at his desk, not studying the provided training materials, but examining a small vial. Inside, a drop of shimmering liquid swirled lazily. He'd brushed his palm against a tank earlier in the day, collecting just enough residue for analysis. Beside him, a portable density meter hummed quietly. Numbers danced across its display. Richard grinned. Almost like a high-proof spirit, he murmured, jotting notes in a slim, waterproof notebook. In the margins, military terms were carefully disguised as brewing language: finish, clean, sharp, nose, mineral, faint brine, aging potential, high. The environmental control unit in the corner had been slightly modified. Officially, it maintained the dryness humans required. Unofficially, it kept the temperature at the perfect range for his experiments. From the concealed compartment beneath the desk, a faint bubbling could be heard, not loud enough to trigger vibration sensors, but steady. When the hourly security sweep passed, Richard switched his tablet back to the official hydro weapon manual, scrolling slowly as if memorizing procedures. The door vibrated faintly with the passing presence of General Apo. "All good in here, sir," Richard called. The general lingered a moment, then moved on. As soon as the corridor fell silent, Richard's grin returned. He uncapped the vial and took a cautious sniff. "Not bad. Needs a little citrus," he whispered. Then, with the care of someone handling something both precious and dangerous, he poured the sample into his hidden equipment. The liquid hissed softly, mixing with other components. The smell that rose was sharp, clean, and, to a human nose, oddly inviting. Morning in the Lumar military district was heavy with mist. Sunlight filtered weakly through the bioengineered canopy above the city, scattering into pale beams that glinted off the gel-lined streets. General Apo stood on an elevated observation platform, looking down into the vast training dome. The arena's floor was a network of shallow, interconnected pools, each no deeper than a hand's breadth, perfect for Lumar mobility. Above them, holographic targets flickered in and out of existence, enemy silhouettes dissolved into harmless vapor when hit. The humidity was carefully balanced at 62%, the highest a human could tolerate without distress. Richard Maxwell stood at one end of the field, wearing a black and silver dry suit designed specifically for him. The seals around the wrists, ankles, and neck were triple reinforced. The Lumar had left nothing to chance. In theory, not a drop of hydro compound could breach it. In theory. Today, Apo announced, his voice vibrating through the dome, "You will witness our standard live-fire exercise. Do not deviate from your position. Your distance from the dispersal zone is for your safety." "Got it," Richard called back, giving a thumbs up. He was already inching forward, splashing through the shallow gel toward the firing line. The general's ripples tightened in warning. hold your position. Richard stepped back half a pace, then immediately drifted forward again as the Lumar squad began their display. 8 soldiers moved in perfect diamond formation, their bodies rippling in sync. At a signal, they raised their hydro weapons, sleek, pressurized packs connected to flexible sprayers. A shimmering arc of deadly liquid shot forward, striking 3 vapor targets at once. The mist swirled away, leaving nothing behind. Richard watched with narrowed eyes. "Your dispersion's wide," he said loudly. The nearest soldier, Cadet Morp, shot him a glare. "Wide dispersion ensures complete coverage." "Yeah," Richard muttered, "but you're losing half your payload to overspray." Apo ignored the comment, focusing on the weapon telemetry streaming across his wrist display. Pressure levels, molecular stability, dispersal efficiency, all perfect. But his attention snagged on a different reading, elevated atmospheric moisture near the human. It wasn't dangerous, just odd. The exercise continued. The Lumar squad eliminated wave after wave of targets. Richard, assigned to observe, seemed more interested in watching the reload process. When one cadet detached a nearly empty hydro pack, Richard leaned forward. "Mind if I take a closer look at that?" he asked. "Absolutely not," the cadet replied sharply. Richard grinned anyway. "Just curious about the nozzle design." Apo's ripples began to vibrate with irritation. "Maxwell, this is not an engineering workshop. Return to your post." By the end of the session, the squad had achieved a 99.8% target elimination rate. Richard had achieved 2 half-hearted sprays, both missing their marks. That evening, security teams reviewed the storage logs. Hydro weapons were kept in temperature and humidity-controlled vaults, each container tracked to the milliliter. And yet, for the 3rd night in a row, a small but measurable amount was missing from one of the tanks. 0.27 liters. Gone. There were no signs of forced entry. No unauthorized personnel recorded. The vibration sensors had detected nothing. Apo convened a quiet meeting with his security chief, a tall, pale Lumar whose ripples flowed with barely contained worry. "Could the compounds be degrading?" the chief asked. "Impossible. Conditions are optimal," Apo replied. He hesitated. "Have the humans' quarters been checked?" "Not directly," the chief admitted. "High Command insists on respecting the exchange program. Too much scrutiny could harm relations." Apo's ripples flattened in reluctant agreement. "Then we observe closely." The next morning, Richard arrived for training 20 minutes late, carrying a large silver flask labeled human electrolyte supplement. He offered no explanation beyond, "long shower." During the day's lesson on hydro compound stability, Richard asked questions that made the science officer's membrane tighten in suspicion. "So, you said you control the fermentation time exactly, right?" "Fermentation is not the correct term," the officer replied sharply. "We say maturation." Right, Richard said. "And what's the optimal storage temperature for flavor, potency?" The officer's ripples flashed alarm, but before he could respond, Apo cut in. "Temperature control is classified. Next question." Richard leaned back in his chair, hands behind his head. "Just wondering if warmer temps make it, smoother." By the 5th day, more hydro compound was missing. The amounts were always small, never more than 0.3 liters, but the pattern was undeniable. Always from a different tank. Always after lights out. Apo could no longer ignore it. He authorized Operation Moisture Watch. That night, 12 guards took hidden positions along the gel circulation vents leading to the weapon vault. Sensors were recalibrated to pick up the faint, uneven vibrations of human footsteps. Ultraviolet tracking powder, invisible to human eyes, was spread along the primary corridors. Apo himself remained in the control room, monitoring every reading. For hours, nothing happened. The vault remained sealed. The guards stayed still. Then, at 2:47 local time, a faint blip appeared on the sensors, human-sized, moving towards Section 7 of the vault. Section 7 breach, the security chief rippled urgently. The general's body stiffened. Move in. Now. The guards flowed through the vents, silent as shadows. They reached the vault door and waited for Apo's signal. Inside, the sensors picked up a steady heartbeat. Go, Apo ordered. The door folded open, and there was Richard, sitting cross-legged atop a storage container, a Grade X hydro weapon tank open beside him. He was drinking from it. A clear tube ran from the tank straight to his mouth. The level indicator on the side showed nearly half a liter missing. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was Richard lowering the tube with a satisfied sigh. You guys have got to try this batch, he said cheerfully. Smooth as glass. Just a hint of mineral on the finish. Apo's ripples spasmed violently. Cadet Maxwell, that liquid should have destroyed every cell in your body. Richard shrugged. Guess I've got a strong stomach. The medical team arrived seconds later, dragging decontamination equipment. Scanners passed over the human's body, returning readings that made no sense: hydro compound concentration, lethal, cellular dissolution, none. This is impossible, the medical chief muttered. Richard grinned. Nah. You just don't know humans very well. The emergency conference chamber was thick with moisture, the Lumar equivalent of tense air. 12 high-ranking officers stood in a loose circle, their ripples erratic with agitation. In the center sat Richard Maxwell, legs crossed, sipping calmly from a crystal glass that one of the science officers had hastily provided. The glass, unfortunately, was still full of Grade X hydro weapon. General Apo's ripples were sharp and deliberate, broadcasting authority. Explain, he demanded. Richard swirled the liquid lazily, watching the light catch its faint shimmer. You want the long version or the short one? The one that makes sense, the science officer snapped. All right, Richard said, leaning back in his chair. On Earth, we've been making and drinking stuff like this for centuries. Fermentation. Distillation. Preservation. We call them spirits, liquors, alcohol. It's part of our culture. Several officers recoiled slightly, their gel bodies trembling. The weapons master's ripples shifted into outright horror. You mean your species consumes biochemical agents? Not exactly your kind, Richard said with a half-smile. But our bodies can handle compounds that would destroy most others. Ethanol, for instance, totally lethal to some species, recreational to us. And this, he held up the glass, isn't too far off chemically. Stronger, yeah. But still in the same family. That is not possible, the medical chief insisted. The molecular structure is fascinating, Richard interrupted. You guys have got incredible control over the fermentation, maturation, process. Pressure aging, biofiltration, mineral infusions from your gel systems. On Earth, this would sell for, well, a lot. Especially with the deadly alien angle. Apo's voice dropped lower, more dangerous. You are saying our most feared weapon is your drink? Richard shrugged. Pretty much. Silence fell. The only sound was the faint patter of condensation dripping from the ceiling into the floor channels. Every Lumar in the room processed the statement differently: disbelief, outrage, fear. Apo felt all of it through the ripple patterns. The security chief broke it. General, if what he says is true, humans are immune to our primary weapon. Our military deterrence would still work on everyone else, Richard said quickly, holding up a hand. Look, I'm not here to ruin your defense plans. I'm just saying, you've accidentally created the galaxy's finest distilled spirit. If you'd market it right, you could make more allies than you would with intimidation. The weapons master rippled with confusion. Market? Sell. This is war material. Not to us, Richard said. To humans, it's Friday night. Weddings. Celebrations. Social bonding. The only thing dangerous about it for us is a hangover. Apo's mind raced. If the human was telling the truth, and the evidence seemed undeniable, then the Lumar had stumbled onto a cultural blind spot so vast it could rewrite interspecies relations. But first, there was the immediate problem: a human was loose in their vaults, drinking their stockpile. You will return the stolen compound, Apo said at last, voice like a closing lock. Richard set down the glass reluctantly. Fine. But you're missing an opportunity here. Apo ignored him. Security will seal the vaults. All access, even for this exchange program, is suspended until further notice. Richard gave a small, infuriating grin. All right. But I'll warn you now, you're going to have a hard time keeping it from me if I really want more. That night, 2 guards were posted outside the humans' quarters. Moisture levels were dropped to the lower edge of Lumar comfort to keep him from leaving for walks. Even so, Apo couldn't shake the feeling that containment would not last. Over the next week, the Lumar High Command debated furiously. Reports confirmed that humans metabolized the hydro compounds differently. They didn't dissolve, instead, their bodies processed the liquid as a form of high-proof alcohol. Side effects included mild euphoria, disinhibition, and in extreme doses, unconsciousness, but no tissue destruction. The revelation sent shockwaves through Lumar politics. Some saw it as a catastrophic vulnerability. Others saw opportunity. Richard, for his part, acted like a man on holiday. He attended only the required training sessions, asked endless questions about storage temperatures, and sketched bottle designs in his notebook. The science officer confiscated the notebook once, only to return it 2 hours later under High Command's orders. He's designing packaging, Apo explained flatly when asked why. Packaging. For their deadliest weapon. It was on the 10th day that the unexpected happened. Lumar scouts intercepted a hostile fleet entering the Haven 9 system, a contested world rich in surface water. The enemy species, the Brack, were land-based but had developed weaponized moisture harvesters specifically to counter Lumar forces. Apo was summoned to the strategy chamber. The weapons master outlined the problem: they've adapted. Our hydro dispersal range is limited in dry air. They're forcing engagements where humidity is low. The tactical officer added grimly, and our most concentrated compounds are almost depleted. The thefts, Apo cut him off with a sharp ripple. Enough. His mind ticked through possibilities. None looked good. Then Richard spoke from the corner where he'd been leaning against the wall, apparently unnoticed. You know. I might be able to help. Apo turned slowly. Help? How? Richard's grin widened. Your compounds work best when sprayed into the air, right? But they also work when, let's say, delivered personally. Humans can carry it without harm. You could put me, or any human, behind enemy lines with as much as we can drink. The tactical officer stared. You're suggesting we weaponize humans? Richard shrugged. You wouldn't be the first species to try. Apo didn't like it. But desperate situations called for strange solutions. You would be exposed to combat. Richard said, I've been bored. The mission came together faster than Apo expected. The Lumar had never outfitted a human for covert infiltration, so modifications were improvised: a lightweight suit that allowed free movement, hidden reservoirs in the lining for hydro compound storage, and a sprayer disguised as a canteen straw. In the pre-deployment chamber, Apo approached Richard. If you survive this, the general said, I expect you to leave our vaults alone. Richard gave a half salute. And if I don't survive, I won't be raiding your stock anymore. Apo's ripples flattened. I am not joking. Neither am I. The chamber doors slid open. Ahead lay the arid outskirts of Haven 9, where the Brack forces waited. Behind Richard, Lumar's soldiers readied their dispersal packs, the last of their reserves. Apo could only watch as the human stepped forward into the unknown, carrying inside him what no Lumar soldier could without dying. The surface of Haven 9 stretched wide and dry beneath a pale, washed-out sky. Heat shimmered above cracked flats where shallow lakes had once been, long drained by the brack to deny the Lumar their advantage. The air was painfully thin of moisture, so much so that Apo's escort team wore compact humidifier rigs just to function. Richard Maxwell, however, seemed perfectly fine. He moved at a steady pace, the light infiltration suit clinging to his frame, its hidden reservoirs sloshing faintly with each step. Every drop inside those reservoirs was lethal to most life in the galaxy. To him, it was, well, a drink. They reached the edge of a jagged canyon. Down below, the Brack had established a forward operating camp, rows of modular shelters, moisture harvesters, and weapon emplacements. Heat distortion made the entire base seem to ripple. From their perch, Apo handed Richard a small, flat device. Communication link. One press sends coordinates for extraction. Richard took it, tucking it into a suit pocket. How long do I have? 6 hours before their reinforcements arrive. Richard smirked. Plenty of time. Without another word, he started down the rocky slope. The Brack were hulking, insectoid creatures with jagged mandibles and armor-like exoskeletons. They moved in deliberate, heavy steps, their long forelimbs ending in hooked appendages. The camp buzzed with activity, crews unloading supply crates, others feeding moisture harvesters with captured gel canisters. Richard strolled in like a man heading to a bar. The infiltration suit, from a distance, could pass for civilian gear. His first stop was a stack of Brack supply barrels near the mess shelter. He crouched, pulling a flexible tube from the suit's lining. A quick twist, and the hydro compound began flowing from the hidden reservoirs. He filled an empty barrel halfway, then disconnected. The liquid shimmered faintly in the dim light. Moments later, 2 Brack soldiers lumbered past. One tapped the barrel with a hook, checking its weight. Without hesitation, they rolled it toward the shelter. Richard followed casually. Inside, the mess shelter was hot and cramped, the air heavy with the scent of fermented root paste. Brack soldiers hunched over crude tables, slamming metal cups against the surfaces. A large dispensing tank sat in the corner, connected to a gravity-fed tap. The barrel he'd spiked was dumped in without inspection. Richard didn't stay to watch. He had other targets. Over the next 2 hours, he worked the camp like a man on a schedule. Hydro compound went into water storage bladders, cooking vats, even the coolant system of their mobile artillery. Wherever liquid moved, he found a way to seed it. The Brack, never imagining someone could survive contact with the substance, didn't bother locking their fluid systems. By the 3rd hour, it began. A low, distorted buzzing rose from the mess shelter. Brack voices, usually clipped and harsh, were now uneven, slurred. 2 soldiers stumbled out into the sunlight, mandibles clacking in confusion. More followed, their gait unsteady. Some were laughing, an eerie, chittering sound. Others leaned on each other for balance. Richard stood near the moisture harvester controls, sipping from a cup he'd liberated from the shelter. The hydro compound burned warmly down his throat. He had to admit, the Lumar's fermentation process gave it a sharper kick than anything on Earth. At the canyon ridge, Apo's forward observers reported in. General, the Brack appear to be impaired. Apo frowned. Impaired? They're staggering. Collapsing. Some are singing. The general didn't know whether to be relieved or alarmed. Continue observing. By the 5th hour, the camp was in chaos. Brack soldiers wandered aimlessly, some lying on the ground clicking softly to themselves. A few tried to operate the moisture harvesters but only managed to flood the controls. The air filled with a strange mix of chemical scent and alien inebriation. Richard made his way toward the Central Command shelter. The guards at the entrance barely noticed him. Inside, a BRAC officer was slumped over a table, his claw tracing lazy patterns in the dust. Richard leaned down. "Hey, big guy. How's the day going?" The BRAC made a sound halfway between a grunt and a giggle. Richard reached over and tapped the console, initiating a full shutdown of the camp's defenses. The officer didn't move to stop him. Mission accomplished. He slipped back outside, finding a quiet spot near the canyon wall. Pulling out the comm device, he pressed the extraction button. Minutes later, Apo's strike team swept into the camp. Resistance was non-existent. The few BRAC who could still stand were too disoriented to coordinate. Within an hour, the camp was secured, the moisture harvesters dismantled, and the captured supplies loaded for transport. Richard was sitting on a supply crate when Apo arrived. "You look satisfied," the general said. Richard grinned. "Told you it would work." Apo studied him for a long moment. "You realize this changes everything. If humans can carry, and even enjoy, our weapons, you could operate where no Lumar can." Richard shrugged. "I guess that's one way to put it. Or," he leaned forward slightly, "you could finally start bottling the good stuff and selling it. Imagine the trade agreements you could make." Apo's ripples tightened. "You're insufferable." "And yet," Richard said, standing, "you're not throwing me out." The general had no response to that. Back aboard the Moisture Seeker, the debrief was almost anticlimactic. Casualties, 0. Enemy forces, neutralized. Supplies, secured. The mission's success was undeniable. What unsettled Apo was how easily it had been achieved, without a single lethal spray from their hydro packs. In the days that followed, the story spread through the fleet. Lumar soldiers began looking at Richard differently, not just as an oddity, but as a weapon in his own right. A dangerous, unpredictable one. And then, inevitably, the idea reached high command. 3 days after Haven 9, Apo was summoned to the capital. The council chamber was vast and humid, its ceiling lost in mist. Councilors formed a triple ring, their ripples echoing through the chamber in carefully measured waves. "The human has demonstrated an unexpected tactical capacity," one councilor said. "We propose a joint venture." Apo's ripples stilled. "Joint venture? Export," another said simply. "To human markets. Controlled distribution. In return, they supply operatives immune to our weapons." Apo felt the floor tilt beneath him, not physically, but politically. The council was talking about turning their greatest military asset into a luxury commodity. And Richard Maxwell, standing at the far end of the chamber, was smiling like a man who had just won the galaxy's strangest lottery. 2 planetary cycles later, the Moisture Seeker hovered in low orbit above Haven 9. The ship's membrane walls pulsed with readiness, their pale glow reflecting the steady hum of the vessel's circulatory systems. But this time, the hydro packs lining the loading bay were not the standard military issue. They were in bottles. Clear, faceted glass bottles. Each one sealed with ornate gold foil, the contents shimmering faintly under the bay lights. Labels in flowing script read Lumi Reserve, Vintage 482. To the Lumar soldiers, they were still weapons. To humans, they looked like high-end spirits. General Apo stood on the bridge, staring at the tactical displays. Below, another BRAC outpost clung to the edges of Haven 9's largest inland lake. The BRAC had fortified it with moisture-draining pylons and energy barriers, clearly expecting traditional Lumar assault patterns. This time, they weren't getting one. "Status on the human operative?" Apo asked without looking away from the displays. "Infiltration gear loaded," replied the tactical officer. "Reservoirs, fully stocked." His ripples carried an undertone of disbelief. "Operative Maxwell is sampling the payload for quality assurance." Apo closed his eyes briefly. Of course he is. In the loading bay, Richard was tightening the straps on his lightweight suit. The hidden reservoirs hugged his torso and legs, the liquid sloshing softly. On the bench beside him sat one of the ornate bottles, uncorked. He took a sip, smacked his lips, and nodded approvingly. Smooth, he muttered. Little more mineral than last batch, but nice finish. A young Lumar soldier, not much older than Richard in human years, stared at him with wide eyes. That could dissolve me instantly. Richard grinned. Then you should probably stay on my good side. The drop pod released from the moisture seeker with a muffled thump. Inside, Richard sat strapped to a cushioned seat, the bottles of payload secured in padded slots along the wall. The descent was fast, the pod cutting through thin cloud before slamming into the ground just outside the Brack sensor perimeter. He popped the hatch, stepping into air that was dry and cool compared to the humid Lumar city. Ahead, the outpost loomed, angular metal structures built for function, not comfort. Brack guards patrolled the perimeter, their movements crisp and mechanical. Richard hoisted a crate from the pod, its side stenciled with Brack supply codes copied from captured intel. The crate clinked faintly as he carried it toward the nearest gate. Delivery, he called out casually. The guards looked at each other, mandibles clicking in silent communication. One stepped forward, examining the crate. He didn't bother opening it, just waved Richard inside. The mess shelter was the same as every Brack installation, hot, noisy, and smelling faintly of metallic oil. Soldiers crowded around a central serving station where barrels of nutrient slurry were dispensed into metal troughs. Richard set the crate down near the serving crew and popped the lid. Inside, the ornate bottles gleamed under the shelter's harsh lights. The Brack handling the serving station tilted his head. What is this? Trade shipment, Richard said smoothly. New morale ration from Central Command. The Brack made a low hum of approval, immediately uncorking one bottle. The liquid poured into a wide metal basin, mixing with their root paste. Richard suppressed a grin. Within minutes, it began. The same slurred clicks. The uneven steps. The occasional, inexplicable bursts of chittering laughter. Richard moved through the outpost with practiced ease, leaving samples in water tanks, coolant lines, and the personal flasks of any officer careless enough to leave them unattended. By the time he reached the command shelter, the air was already thick with the chemical tang of intoxicated Brack. From the moisture seeker, Apo monitored the feeds from microdrones shadowing Richard. The footage showed Brack soldiers stumbling, dropping equipment, and in one surreal scene, attempting to dance in slow, awkward sways. Are we certain this isn't dangerous to them? Asked the medical officer beside Apo. Not in the lethal sense, Apo replied grimly. But in the operational sense, he gestured at the displays. They are already defeated. Richard reached the command shelter without challenge. The Brack commander was slouched in his chair, mandibles slack, claws tapping an aimless rhythm on the desk. Hi there, Richard said cheerfully. Mind if I just shut this down? The commander didn't respond as Richard reached over and deactivated the outpost's energy barriers. The control lights winked out one by one. He tapped his comm link. Package delivered. Wrapping up here. The strike came quickly. Lumar's soldiers surged from the lakeshore, their dispersal packs unleashing controlled arcs of hydro compound. This time, the Brack barely tried to resist. In less than 20 minutes, the outpost was secured. Apo arrived to find Richard leaning against a supply crate, sipping from one of the gold-foiled bottles. You're enjoying this far too much, the general said. Richard raised the bottle in a mock toast. Why shouldn't I? You guys make an excellent product. And it works. Apo's ripples shifted into something between resignation and reluctant amusement. High Command has approved full-scale production. With human distribution channels. Richard's grin widened. I'll have Earth's distilleries lined up before the week's out. Weeks later, the transformation was complete. Lumar hydro weapon facilities had been rebranded as specialty distilleries. Bottling lines were retooled for ornate glass and crystal containers. Labels boasted phrases like aged under pressure and fermented in the depths of Lumar Prime. On Earth, the spirits sold for astronomical prices. In the Lumar military, the same products still filled their dispersal packs. And in conflicts where humans participated, the bottles served double duty, morale drink and stealth weapon. The galaxy was baffled. To most, the hydro weapons remained a name whispered in fear. To humans, they were something you ordered at a high-end bar. On the Moisture Seeker's observation deck, Apo stood beside Richard, watching crates of the newest batch being loaded for shipment. The labels read Victory Vintage, Haven, 9 Edition. I still don't fully understand how this became reality, Apo admitted. Richard took a long, slow sip from his glass. Because you saw a weapon. I saw potential. Potential for profit. For culture. For changing the way two species see each other. Apo's ripples settled into the slow, steady patterns of acceptance. Perhaps you're right. Perhaps we needed to be reminded that not everything deadly must be used for war. Richard grinned. And sometimes, the best way to win a war, is to throw a party first. Below them, a group of younger Lumar soldiers clinked their ornate bottles together in a human-style toast. Somewhere far away, on an Earthside broadcast, an advertisement was already running, from the depths of Lumar Prime, taste the legend. Victory Vintage, the spirit that won a war. And Richard Maxwell, the first human ever to drink a Lumar hydro weapon and live, was already planning the next batch.